Good afternoon. The disembodied voice you're hearing is that of Diane Proctor. Fred Van Dusen and I are recording my opening remarks because on the evening that Lawrence Lessig spoke, there were some technical difficulties, some irritating echoes, and we're trying to make it cleaner for all of you to hear and to enjoy this remarkable evening. I began by thanking Fred for all of his work, by thanking the church for the very good opportunity to use the First Parish in such a creative and productive way, and to thank all of the people on the Reclaim Our Democracy team. Our sponsors for the event this evening are the Reclaim Our Democracy group here at First Parish and Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice. Reclaim Our Democracy is an inclusive, collaborative, multi-partisan movement. Our group goal is to reclaim our democratic rights as citizens of the United States of America and to have a government that truly represents and supports the needs and desires of all people. Unitarian Universalists for Social Justice is a national organization that works with UU congregations and members to advocate for important issues with their members of Congress. They actually work in Congress in Washington, D.C., which provides an intimacy and an opportunity to potentially have some significant influence. And one of the movers and shakers in all of this nationally is our own Fred Van Dusen. They have 4 priority areas: democracy, immigration, environment, and inequality. The Reclaim Our Democracy group is partnered with the UUSJ Democracy Action Team in their efforts to help build an inclusive, collaborative, and powerful democracy movement. We hope that those of you here this evening, or those of you here this afternoon listening to this program, will support and participate in this critical effort at this time in our country. Lawrence Lessig, our speaker this evening, is a Harvard professor of law, a lawyer, and a thoughtful, penetrating political activist. He is a consummate scholar, having earned his undergraduate degree from the University of Pennsylvania, his master's degree from Trinity College, Cambridge, which had a profound influence on him intellectually, and his law degree from Yale. In 1989, and I take us back to that time for a reason, Professor Lessig was a law clerk for 2 influential conservative judges, Judge Richard Posner of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the 7th Circuit, and then for Justice Antonin Scalia of the U.S. Supreme Court from 1909 to 1991. They chose him because they considered him brilliant, rather than for his ideology, effectively making him the token liberal of their respective staffs. Later, Richard Posner would call Professor Lessig the most distinguished law professor of his generation. He is the author of several books, including How to Steal a Presidential Election, America Compromised and Republic Lost. Arguing that America is an idea, but an idea founded on fundamental ideals, he will be presenting his thoughts tonight on what we need to do to protect our democracy at this critical time in our history. Welcome to Concord, once again, Professor Lessig.
I was saying I'm very happy to be back, but I wish I had happier news to share. We're at a terrifying moment, but that doesn't mean we should be terrified. It means we need to understand what has to happen to restore what is the best of democracy and to resist what's growing as its greatest threats. But in telling that story, I wanted to return to a time that looking out in the audience, I guess most people here remember. Time of this man as president. I find that most of my students don't know anything about this man. In particular, they know nothing about the extraordinary range of conflicts and so-called scandals that marred his administration. Initially around the Whitewater scandal, a special prosecutor was appointed to investigate and determine whether crimes had been committed. Then a civil plaintiff's lawyers gave the special prosecutor information about this woman. And this woman then was said to have been in a relationship with the president, which the president firmly denied. I'm going to hope the technology works here. No, you can't hear it.
I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms.
Let's
Lewinsky.
try it again.
But I want to say one thing to the American people. I want you to listen to me. I'm going to say this again. I did not have sexual relations with that woman, Ms. Lewinsky. I never told anybody to lie, not a single time, never. Accusations are false, and I need to go back to work for the American people. Thank you.
Okay, so his statements were false, obviously. And within a short time, a certain blue dress became the focus of the obsessive coverage of the news, and in particular, the DNA on the blue dress, which led to Clinton's impeachment, for which, of course, he was eventually acquitted in the United States Senate, with neither charge having even a majority vote against him. And after this event, he told a very close friend the lie, his lie, saved him, because it gave him time to muster the support that it would take to resist the incredible pressure that was brought against him. Okay, now here's the point of reminding you of this unhappy part of our recent American history. The right believed they were justified in pressing the charges against the president. They pointed to his terrible behavior, to his illegal behavior, which of course his perjury was illegal behavior. And they said that those two things together justified the legitimate prosecution of the president through impeachment. And on the left, the response was slightly different. Strikingly, the left did not defend the behavior, and the left didn't say it was illegal, that it was legal behavior. They conceded that the lies constituted a crime. But what they said was this was persecution, not prosecution. This was an effort by the Republicans to take down the president through lawfare, not law, and that it was unjust and wrong to bring these actions against him for those political reasons. And I remember viscerally, because this is the beginning of my legal career as a law professor, demanding a certain kind of immunity for the president, not absolute immunity, not permanent immunity, but just immunity enough to say, look, if there are issues, let's deal with him after he is president. Let's not allow this process to bind him, to tie him up as he tried to do the job of president. Because we all said the behavior was not okay. The lies, a relationship with an intern. But it's not because the behavior was okay, it was because lawfare was so bad. The idea that they would use law to defeat, for political purposes, the operation of the president was so bad. Now, I remember when this debate was happening, being astonished that this point wasn't obvious to everybody. Astonished that there were those who really thought it was essential to impeach a president for lying about sex. Yet there were people who genuinely believed that. And there were people on my side who thought it crazy. We lived in these separate bubbles, and we were self-righteous in our views within our bubbles. Now, those bubbles had been fueled throughout the 1990s, and they would be fueled dramatically in the 2000s. This study, I think, is the most terrifying graph in political science. This maps the ideology of the three major cable broadcast networks, CNN, Fox, and MSNBC. And what this is saying is around 2000, they're basically the same ideologically. There's no sharp difference. But over the next decade, these networks veer dramatically because they learned a truth about the business model that would succeed on cable television. It wasn't to mimic Walter Cronkite. It was to find a way to mark your niche and to feed your niche segment. And that's what they did. That's what they did on the right and what they did on the left. And as they did that, our bubbles grew even further apart. Now, that's the consequence of cable television. The internet made that worse. Actually, not the internet precisely, it was the business model of the internet. Because the business model of the internet is advertising, and it's advertising driven by artificial intelligence, this kind of cyborg here, that is constantly figuring out what it needs to serve you to get you to stay connected so it can show you more ads. Our first contact, as Tristan Harris puts it, with this AI was through social media. Tristan Harris is a former Google engineer who saw the light and quit Google to start the Center for Humane Technology because he was so deeply anxious about what the infrastructure that Google was building was doing to American society. He's famous for this film, The Social Dilemma, which is a documentary about social media, the most viewed documentary in the history of documentaries. But after he left Google, he focused attention on the work that was being done inside of Silicon Valley on the science of attention. That is, using artificial intelligence to engineer our attention to overcome the natural resistance we would have to these devices so as to increase our engagement with these devices. Because engagement, the amount of time you spend staring at your machine, or more likely your grandchildren spend staring at their machines, is the business model. Every second they get is more money for them. This business model gets its profit through what Tristan calls brain hacking. Okay, so what is brain hacking? Well, let's start first by thinking about what we might call body hacking. Might be more familiar. There's an extraordinary industry, of course, in America and around the world, exploiting food science to engineer food, to give it the perfect mix of salt, sugar, and fat, so they can exploit evolution to overcome a natural resistance you would have to eating too much food so that you can't stop eating too much food. They do this to sell more food, or maybe it's quote food. And that selling more food is done by tricking your body into consuming more than your body otherwise would naturally lead you to consume. Brain hacking is the same, but with attention. Exploiting evolution, the fact that we react to random rewards in a really obsessive way, or the fact that we can't stop consuming endless feeds of content, exploiting these features of who we are with the aim to increase engagement so that the AI can better model you. It figures out who you are so it can sell you more ads. And when it models you, it figures out what your interests are, what you're likely to be interested in pursuing. And as it does that, it will build an extremely profitable model that it then rents out to others. I've created a revolution online, apparently. And so I just hope everything's okay. Okay, now here's the reason this is a problem. It just so happens that we will engage more with these platforms. The more extreme, the more polarizing, and the more hate-filled they are. The AI learned this about us. It fed us a bunch of things, and it turned out that when it fed us the really hate-filled, emotional, dramatic stuff, we engage more. So the AI said, fine, we'll just feed more and more of this polarizing content to this public. And so that's what we're fed. With the consequence that this idealized conception of we the people increasingly becomes we the polarized, ignorant, and angry people. And our democracy is thereby weakened almost to the point of total collapse. I asked AI to draw this picture for me. This is the picture it drew me. And the almost to the point of total collapse is, of course, the extraordinary events that we watched unfold on January 6th, 2021. Because what's extraordinary about these events is, first of all, the vast majority of these people honestly believed the election had been stolen. 70% of Republicans said they agreed with President Trump's contention that he received more votes than Joe Biden. And even Republicans with college degrees believed the election results were fraudulent, the Washington Post reported. This is not about ignorance. This is about people who have been fed information that they thought was true, and that information said your democracy has been hacked and your election has been stolen. And so the question is, what should they do if that's what they believe? This graph shows that 70% of Republicans means 30% of Americans had that belief on January 6, 2021. But here's the scary fact about this graph. That number has not changed. The same number of people today believe the election was stolen as believed it was stolen on January 6, 2021, even though we've had endless coverage of the question whether this election was stolen, and there's no credible basis for believing that Joe Biden didn't win in a fair way this election. Yet, these beliefs sustain themselves throughout. Now, this is something new. Many of us will remember the extraordinary President Richard Nixon. Here's Richard Nixon's popularity numbers until just before he had to resign. Notice it's about Donald Trump's. Republicans loved him about as much as Donald Trump was loved. Democrats didn't hate him as much as Democrats hated Donald Trump, and independents are in the middle. But here's what's dramatic about this picture. In the period leading up to his impeachment, support among all three groups collapses at the same rate. We are all watching the same show. The same show is telling us this man is a crook. And slowly, all of us come to recognize this man is a crook. Now, of course, Republicans still like him more than Democrats. But we all saw the facts and we reacted to the same story in the way that story would lead any reasonable person to react. Here's Donald Trump's graph over the whole of his 4 years. It never changes. No matter what happens, Republicans like him just as much, Democrats hate him just as much. This is a product, this, I want to say, is a new normal. It's a product of us living in these totally separate universes, where every fact is interpreted in the way you want to hear it interpreted. So if you are a MAGA Republican and you hear about some claim about some crime the president has committed, this is yet another witch hunt. This has no basis in fact. It's just Democrats trying to use the law to make sure the president, Donald Trump, is not the president again. So this reality, as Barack Obama says, if you watch Fox News, you're in one reality. If you read the New York Times, you're in a different reality, means the very basis for how a democracy is supposed to function has been removed. The basis for a democracy is that we come with different values and confront a common set of facts and decide, what are we going to do about that? But now we come with different values and confront different sets of facts. And we never have a conversation about the same question because we view the world in radically different ways. And I want to say that this should cue in us a certain kind of paranoia about the media infrastructure we now live in. We need to be paranoid. We need to have a particular kind of paranoia, the paranoia maybe of the hunted. You remember the birds, right? Or all of a sudden you realize these animals are out to get you, or the modern version of this from Black Mirror, this is called a metalhead. These are robot dogs that are trained to hunt you down and to capture you. Police owns these dogs, but anybody could obviously deploy them. But the point is, we need to recognize we are surrounded in this infrastructure of media with an intelligence out to get us. In a literal sense, it is out to get our attention, and it will do whatever it takes to get our attention, including constructing totally different views of the world, if that's what will draw you in. And the point is, our perceptions, our collective misperceptions are not accidental here. They are expected. They are intended. They are the product of this AI. We could call it the AI perceptions machine, and we are its targets. They give us what we want on our cell phones 24/7. What we want turns us into people like this. Okay, now we need to recognize this is not because AI is so strong. It's because we are so weak. Okay, I'm going to skip a video because it's not easy to hear a video. So I'll show you what this video says. What Tristan Harris describes in this video is we're constantly trying to worry about when something called artificial general intelligence, which is when artificial intelligence is as good or better than humans on every dimension of intelligence. Everybody's worried about when we get to artificial general intelligence. And that's when AI overcomes human strengths. Like, it's better than the best of us. But what Tristan says is we actually need to be worried about when it can overwhelm our weaknesses. When we can't control ourselves enough not to eat that extra buffalo wing or consume another hour of TikTok. That's a weakness, not a strength. And what his movie, Social Dilemma, was focused on was the individual human weaknesses. But I think we also need to think about the collective human weakness. It's not just that individuals are surrounded by these technologies trying to get them to do what the technologies want. It's also that we all are surrounded by these technologies trying to get us to do what the technologies want. So long before we get this terrifying artificial general intelligence, it overwhelms us. AI gets what it seeks, which is our engagement, and we get democracy hacked. That's the consequence of first contact, when all AI was good at was deciding what you should watch in order to get you engaged. Really smart, effective targeting. But what about second contact? What about when the AI can not only figure out what you should watch, but can figure out how to talk to you, how to say things to you, how to create messages to you, how to engage with you? You don't even know it's a machine engaging with you in ways to bring you in. Again, we don't even begin to know the efficacy of this next generation of AI, which is right now being deployed in elections around the world and will be deployed in this election in 2024. But when we recognize that and we answer the question, what happens when it not just targets, but creates, I think we have a double reason to be terrified. There used to be a great series called Game of Thrones. I really hate the writers because they ruined the last season. So you can't talk about Game of Thrones anymore. But Game of Thrones had this echo throughout, which is winter is coming, which was the foretelling of a extremely terrifying event, the invasion of a being that was coming down from the north. And this is the sense I think we need to recognize about what AI's contribution to democracy right now will be. Okay, so what can be done? My title said, Democracy's Crisis and How It Ends. So there's a longer term change that might end its crisis. And this is a change I'm extraordinarily excited about. And it's a change that echoes and resonates with the tradition that this universalist tradition speaks to. And then there's a today response, something all of us must practice right now. So let's start with the longer term. If you're confronting a flood, the obvious response is to move to higher ground, to protected ground. And if we think about our democracy confronting a flood of super intelligent technology that is figuring out how to engage us by turning us into polarized, ignorant people who hate each other, the response is to find a way to move away from that technology, to insulate democracy, or you might say shelter democracy from AI's force, from AI's harmful force. Moving from this unprotected space where democracy withers to a shielded space where democracy could maybe thrive. Now recognize the law already does this in the context of juries. The deliberations of juries happen within a protected space, in the sense that jurors only hear what the judge says ought to be considered. Both sides get to present their evidence. The evidence is filtered if it's not worthy of being evidence. But in that process, jurors get information which they then get to deliberate upon to decide extremely significant issues, like whether Exxon has to pay $50 billion for oil spills, or whether in some states, the citizen will lose his or her life. This idea of protected democracy, democracy reformers are trying to adopt in the context of ordinary democracy. So these reformers are pushing around the world, and increasingly in the United States, something called citizen assemblies. So the way a citizen assembly works, you can think of it as a better version of a jury. It's a random, representative, informed, and deliberated body of citizens. So for example, 300 citizens who were randomly chosen and representative of the population. So the right number of women, the right number of Democrats, the right number of whatever category is important for the deliberation. They then are given information in a process that guarantees that both sides are presented fairly. And then they have a chance to talk with each other in small groups and in large groups, hearing questions answered that people will raise. This process is, in the sense I was describing before, a protected space. So for example, Iceland, after the 2008 crisis, convened a national forum where they randomly selected 1,000 Icelandic citizens. It's a country of about 330,000, so 1,000 is a large proportion. And they deliberated over a weekend to determine the values that a new constitution needed to adopt. And then those values were binding on a council which then crafted a new constitution, a constitution that was endorsed by 2/3 of the public in a national referendum, and then promptly ignored by the legislature, but we'll put that fact aside. Ireland is a much more optimistic story. Also after the crisis, Ireland started a process of convening citizen assemblies These were much smaller, just 100 people, random representative selection from the population, which have considered a series of really fundamental questions in Ireland, including same-sex marriage and abortion, two issues which we know the Irish Parliament could never have touched. But both issues were reformed in fundamental ways, allowing same-sex marriage, allowing the deregulation of abortion, and those recommendations were then adopted overwhelmingly in referendum by the Irish people. And now every year, Ireland runs fundamental questions about what Ireland should do through this citizen assembly process. In France, 12 years ago, a radical member of the parliament suggested a citizen assembly. Every party signed a document saying that would be a complete violation of representative democracy. They will never have it in France. Now, candidates running for president routinely promise that they will convene a citizen assembly on incredibly important issues, and they have. Macron has had one on climate change. He's had one on end-of-life decisions. He's announced there will be a third. They've not said what the subject is. And these recommendations are then taken back to the parliament and through the political process constrain or inspire the parliament to respond. Okay. Now the point here is these are extraordinarily hopeful and exciting innovations that are happening everywhere and increasingly in the United States. And they won't replace elected representatives, but we can imagine them as constraining or standing next to elected representatives, making sure that they pass the kinds of rules we know elected representatives are never going to pass. For example, my favorite, as you probably know, rules to address the corrupting influence of money in politics. We know, first, Congress is not going to deal with that. And second, a citizen assembly comprised of random representative Americans, number of Republicans that need to be there, the number of Democrats that need to be there, men, women, whatever, would overwhelmingly support fundamental reform of that issue. There is a whole list of issues we know our government can't address, and which we also know that a process like this would address and could begin to get the confidence and support of the public enough to make this a complement to the ordinary representative democratic process that we have, constraining what it does and inspiring it to act where it doesn't have the courage to act. But the point is not just that this is a cool new innovation. I want you to see it's not just a good idea, it's existential for democracy when you consider the otherwise dominating effect of these technologies that have now wired themselves into our lives. It's essential for the security for democracy to make sure that Russians or Chinese can't exploit these technologies in ways that undermine our democracy, or at least not all of it, because at least these assemblies would be relatively insulated from that process, a way of protecting us from the consequence of this AI, an AI that steers us against a public will. So it's a change not to make it just better, it's to make democracy survive in this terrifying, yet I think exhilarating moment, long before superintelligence, long before AGI threatens us. It's something we can do while we still have time to do it. Okay, that's the longer term. So now let me talk about something we're going to do today, or over the next 130 days until the election, to address this question of how this crisis might end. Because the critical need for us now is to find a way to look forward. This book that there's a couple copies available in the back that I wrote with my friend Matt Seligman, How to Steal a Presidential Election, goes through the risks that the law now has for anybody playing hardball politics in a world where good faith in the process has evaporated. And it identifies strategies which, if the election is close, would work to flip the results from what otherwise would be the appropriate democratic actions. But what frustrates me, and I think my friend Matt, is that our acts in the period leading up to this election are only making these risks worse. So let's take one example. It's going to surprise you that I'm saying this, but I want to surprise you. I want to make this interesting for you. So here, the war on so-called fake electors. Okay, so 4 states have now attempted to prosecute the Trump electors who gathered on Electors Day, the day that electors are supposed to cast their ballot, and cast their ballots for Donald Trump, and then sent those certificates off to Washington. And they have prosecuted them because they say they are fake, they've committed fraud, and that fraud shall be punished, including by criminal prosecution in some states. Now, I feel a little bit guilty about all of that because it turns out just before the election, Van Jones and I wrote an article trying to counsel Pennsylvania to take its time, if the election was close, to make sure it got the numbers right. And our argument was, you can recount all the way up until January 6th. And so long as the electors have met and cast their ballots, then the final certification that you come to will be the certification Congress has to consider. And the precedent for that was Hawaii. In 1960, this man was the winner of the initial count in Hawaii. He was certified to be the winner. And then when they noticed the numbers didn't add up, the Democrats asked for a recount. The problem was the recount couldn't be completed by the time that the electors had to vote. Indeed, it was completed on December 30th. Kennedy was declared the winner, and the governor issued a new certification saying that Kennedy was the winner. Now, the challenge with this whole scenario was, if the recount continues after the electors are supposed to meet and vote, what should the electors do? So on Electors Day, both the Democratic and the Republican electors met in this building and cast their ballots. These were the first fake electors in modern American history. But when those ballots were sent to Washington, Nixon, as vice president, overseeing the counting of the electoral ballots, reported to Congress that he had 2 certifications, one for Nixon, one for Kennedy, but he believed he needed to pick Kennedy's because Kennedy's was the later certification. Okay, now, what if that same scenario happened today? I mean, it's not going to be Nixon versus Kennedy, obviously, but they're about as old as Nixon and Kennedy would have been. So what if that same certification happened today? In a world where electors are being prosecuted for felonies, for meeting and casting their ballot when they have not yet been certified, would the electors even meet? Or one of my favorite series, Succession, season 4, episode 8, has an extraordinary hypothetical. The hypothetical is, in the state of Wisconsin, there's a fire in the Milwaukee polling place. And so the Milwaukee ballots are lost. Well, the Milwaukee ballots are overwhelmingly Democratic. So when you take those out, the state goes for the Republican. And so the Republican is declared the winner of the state, and then Arizona is declared for the Republican as well. And I was going to show you this really cool scene where this happens, but anyway, we're not going to go through that now. I'm instead just going to walk you through a hypothetical and ask you what should happen. So imagine we have a hypothetical in Wisconsin where the Milwaukee polling station is burned. I use the passive voice here not to cast aspersions on anyone. The Republican, therefore, wins Wisconsin. The governor orders an extension of Milwaukee's opportunity to vote because the newly amended Electoral Count Reform Act gives the governor that power. But that law has never been tested. So imagine a state court says the governor doesn't have that power because Congress doesn't have the power to control how the votes are collected in Wisconsin. And say the governor appeals that up through the appellate process to get to the United States Supreme Court. But imagine Electors Day comes while this whole process is going on. Who should vote on Electors Day in Madison? Or it's Madison, yeah. Because the Constitution requires that the votes of electors have to happen on the same day. And if they don't vote on that day, those votes can't be counted. Okay, now, if the Democrats in my scenario don't meet and vote, then the litigation is moot, which is a lawyer's way of saying is it can't go on because they can't do anything, because if they didn't vote, there are no votes to count, so therefore the court has to stop its consideration. If the Democrats do vote, are they, quote, fake electors? Have they committed fraud under state law? Will they be prosecuted for the meeting and asserting that they are the electors that represent the state of Wisconsin? The point is that this whole effort to vilify these fake electors, many of whom don't know anything about the law. They were just told that they needed to vote in order to preserve the right to appeal that the campaign believed it had. Because of this effort, we have increased the risk that we will have a result that doesn't reflect the actual views of the public, not decreasing the risk. We have increased it because we are so focused on punishing people who we are so angry at, rather than thinking strategically, looking forward and recognizing recounts might be necessary for Democrats to win, or challenging of bad acts by election officials might be necessary for Democrats to win. And so both sides should have an interest in having the most opportunity to resolve these questions in an orderly way possible. But the result of the Electoral Count Reform Act and these prosecutions is exactly the opposite. And more generally, this is even more outrageous for me to say, but here, I'll be outrageous. I think we have to adopt a discipline of practicing understanding of the other side. Practicing it, meaning it's going to be hard, like practicing the Boston Marathon. We don't have to do that, but this is easier than that. Practicing it's going to be hard. To recognize this is what we should do rather than the obtuseness that most of us have when we think about what the other side is talking about. I mean, I myself can't understand what they're saying most of the time when they tell me why they're doing what they're doing. My former colleague, a former judge, Michael McConnell, had this really incredible piece in the Wall Street Journal this last week, trying to explain why Republicans don't abandon felon Trump. And McConnell starts by saying, he doesn't support Trump, even though he's a Republican. He thinks Trump should have been convicted on the second impeachment. He thinks it's outrageous that he wasn't, so he's not defending Trump at all. But what he's saying is something that should be familiar to you when you go back to the first part of what I talked about and think about Bill Clinton. Because what McConnell is saying is, when you guys, during the Clinton days, felt that the Republicans were engaging in lawfare, not law, when they prosecuted Clinton for his wrongful acts, that's precisely what Republicans think is happening to their president now. Because now you have people on the left, Democrats, pointing to terrible behavior and illegal behavior that they say legitimate prosecution. In the technical sense that this behavior is illegal and therefore should be prosecuted. Interestingly, on the right, it's not that they agree it's terrible behavior. It's just behavior, behavior of Donald Trump. Like, we understand what that is. And it's not illegal, it's just unpleasant. But they certainly believe that the prosecutions are political persecutions, not legitimate prosecutions. They are lawfare, not law. And even though I don't agree with this, that view is understandable when you pause and think about exactly what the elements to the argument is. First of all, we have state prosecutors who ran for office promising that they would prosecute this man. And they were elected according to those promises. And they advanced novel theories which I think are true, but they are new as a way to grab this political behavior and turn it into a felony in New York. And the Georgia case depends on how you view the so-called fake electors. And the same with the federal crimes. No doubt, never as extreme, but other presidents have engaged in behavior related to their official secret documents, never prosecuted, never brought. Now, my point is not that the two people are equivalent. I can't help but say I think Donald Trump's crimes are wildly more obvious, and in a completely fair way, he ought to be held to account. And I think Bill Clinton's crimes are just the product of a certain pathology that I feel very sorry for him for having, and I'm angry that he wasted his second administration in that crisis. But the point to see is not that these are two equivalents. It's that the complaint is similar between them. They're both seen to be politically targeted prosecutions. They're seen to be that by people living within that bubble. And because they are seen to be that, they have a dramatic effect on the overall confidence that people have in this system. Justice Robert Jackson, who led the prosecution at Nuremberg, taking a leave from the court, once wrote this about prosecutors. He said, if the prosecutor is obliged to choose his case, it follows that he can choose his defendants. Therein is the most dangerous power of the prosecutor, that he will pick people that he thinks he should get, rather than cases that need to be prosecuted. With the law books filled with great assortment of crimes, the prosecutor stands a fair chance of finding at least a technical violation of some act on the part of almost everyone. In such a case, it is not a question of discovering the commission of a crime, and then looking for the man who committed it. It is a question of picking the man and then searching the law books, or putting the investigators to work to pin some offense on him. It is in this realm in which the prosecutor picks some person whom he dislikes or desires to embarrass, or selects some group of unpopular persons and then looks for an offense, that the greatest danger of abuse of a prosecuting power lies. It is here that the law enforcement becomes personal, and the real crime becomes that of being unpopular with the predominant or governing group, being attached to the wrong political views, or being personally obnoxious to, or in the way of the prosecutor himself. This is how they view these prosecutions, exactly as Jackson describes them. And though I don't agree with their view of these prosecutions, these perceptions are real. And if this crisis is to end, it's not going to end by us ignoring these perceptions. So then what do we do? So this is the most controversial. I mean, you should really pay attention now. This is the most controversial thing I'm going to say. I think we need to accept that these prosecutions have taken too long. I should have made that take too long to make the points doubly. They've taken too long. And that Biden needs to exercise his authority to try to get the prosecutions stayed. Now, he doesn't have any power over the state cases, obviously, but he has persuasive authority. And he has arguable power over the Justice Department to say, I want you to put this on hold for now. Because we ought to recognize that within the window of an election, at least within a year of an election, any effort to use law against the other side can't help, in a politically polarized world, to be viewed as lawfare, not justice. And that we need law-free elections so people can believe that the reason their guy lost or their woman lost was that people didn't like that person, not that the law had been used against them. Now, this view will be resisted by most in my profession. Indeed, one of my closest friends, my best man at my wedding, is one of the prosecutors working with Jack Smith. And he will say, as he's often said to me, the rule of law is blind to politics. But the reality is that rule is blind. Because we need to understand that we are being played by this artificial intelligence to turn us into people who can't understand each other. And in that reality, we need to practice the understanding against the views we have, so that we can begin to build again something different than the polarized, hating democracy that we have today. Thank you very much.
We're now going to do some questions and answers. If you can put your questions in the chat, we'll try and get them to Professor Lessig.
We are also fighting the business model of our media. And the point to see is the business model of our media when we grew up was on the side of democracy. Like when Walter Cronkite told the story of the news, it was a unifying event. And when major newspapers were really vigorous investigators of the facts, subsidized through their advertising of classified ads, it was helpful to democracy. The business model of the news from 1950 until 1985 was pro-democratic. And what I'm arguing is the business model of media today is anti-democratic. They're just trying to make a buck. And they can't afford not to work as hard as they can to make a buck. Indeed, I was the lawyer for the Facebook whistleblower, Frances Haugen, when she turned over an extraordinary trove of documents to Congress to demonstrate what's going on in Facebook. Facebook is filled with really super engineers who were working as hard as they could to make that platform safe for democracy. And again, they would raise ideas up to Mark Zuckerberg, and Mark Zuckerberg would veto them again and again. And his reason was, it was against the business interests of the company, like that would suppress engagement. So what I'm saying is, we've got to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. Those problems have not gone away. We've made enormous progress on them. Maybe we'll win, but even if we win, we need to recognize we can't fight this business model the way it is right now. And it's not even clear under our Constitution whether we could regulate it in a way that would make the problem go away. I have ideas, but a lot of my ideas are crazy. So I don't have confidence. And so what I'm saying is, let's think about what we could be adding to the mix that might begin to get us democratic authority that we have a reason to trust, to like, to have faith in. That could begin to constrain these other representative democracy problems and help solve some of them. And so that's the additional bit I'm adding.
Thank you very much for the very interesting talk. So I'm a former Google engineer. I've worked on search, I've worked on ads.
Great.
I've worked with Francis.
Oh, wow.
So
wow.
I agree with your diagnosis here that the business model is the problem, right? And even when there are a good chunk of people who are trying to do the right thing, the business prevents that, right? And so it's not clear to me that you say the government can influence that for all the reasons you say. Do you see other paths to changing how the kind of technology industry is so benefiting from attention and attention equal knowledge?
Yeah. So the question is there a solution? To summarize it, is there a solution? I mean, I'll also say he agreed with everything I said, but in addition to agreeing with everything I said, is there a solution to the incentive problem in Silicon Valley? The social media incentive problem, where their number one objective is to get engagement, and they'll do whatever they can. The AIs will do whatever they can to get it. So if you can use a word which is not allowed to be used in Washington, that word is tax. If you could tax engagement, I think you could change the business model. So imagine what I'll call a quadratic engagement tax that says 1 unit of engagement, the tax is $1. 2 units of engagement, the tax is $4. 3 units of engagement, the tax is $9. The point is, the tax goes up the more you engage. So at a certain point, Google's like, hey, go take your dog for a walk. You've been online too much, because you're being online anymore is going to cost us a lot of money. Now, my belief is, if we had an engagement tax, it would be constitutional. They would fight it, but I think it would be constitutional. It would force them to change their business model. In the same way, government always historically has intervened in markets that produce what economists call externalities that harm society. So, there were coal companies coal-powered electrical plants that produced electricity by spewing carbon and soot into the air. And they were never going to change that on their own. It took the government to come in and say, okay, we're going to tax you for all of this pollution. So if you want to continue to do business, stop doing the pollution. Some of them had to shut down. Some of them figured out ways to do it consistent with the tax or consistent with the regulation. So I think there's a way to do it, but the reality is there's zero political will that could get that done at the federal level. So I think this reality of our completely stalemated federal government forces us to be creative about what else could we imagine building to complement the process that we have right now to get us to a place in the long run, at least, where democratic will gets reflected in what our government does, not just what is in the business interest of its players.
That's my thought, is we have the opportunity as a community to think about what works concrete versus what works Massachusetts, what works in federal. And look at all the data, and what's discouraging from my point of view is that less than half of Concord residents believe they belong in Concord. The number is significantly lower when you ask people whether they believe in America. Notion that you belong somewhere is a fundamental piece of democracy. Unless you're willing to allocate the people who are voting alongside you, who deliberated with you, that basic sense of worth that we all belong here, it's impossible for me to see how we move forward. So I have no hope that we'll make progress on the federal level. God bless you if you can make some progress on the federal level. But I believe that we have an opportunity here in a community like Concord, which is so well educated, it's so progressive. It's not figuring out how do we make everybody feel that they really belong here and reach the bench of democracy where it started 250 years ago.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. So I would say at the federal level, whether or not you think we can succeed, you have to fight as if we will. This is what love means. If you love your country, you don't calculate the odds about whether your engagement will actually work. You say, this is what's necessary for this thing, these people, this community I love. So we're going to fight for it regardless of the odds. But I completely agree with you at the local level. I would only add this. I think the 20th century has given us a very emaciated conception of democracy. Like we sit watching television, we get screamed at by certain ads, we show up once or twice a year to vote. That's what democracy is. But our tradition had a much richer conception of democracy. In Philadelphia in the 18th century, the average juror, of course, that was a white male property owner, but bracketing that problem, the average juror served on a jury 3 times a year. They felt like they were administering the law of Pennsylvania, of Philadelphia, because they were the administrators. They were deciding how it applied. So this is why I think citizen assemblies are so exciting. We could begin to multiply them everywhere. We're talking in Brookline about creating a shadow town meeting that would be, experimenting with the idea of like randomly representative Brookliners who show up to address a particular kind of question, separate from what town meeting does, not to replace town meeting, but to try to add to the experience that people have with governing and with democracy, so everybody feels responsible. It's a duty as much as it's a right. It's a thing we do as much as a thing we watch. And if we don't make it a part of our activity, then you're right, it will be alien and people easily will give it up.
We have a question online, so I'm going to just ask this. While the idea of citizen assemblies is intriguing, how could it work in the US when so many issues, money and politics, reproductive rights, etc., are decided by the Supreme Court, which will not be in any way bound or likely even influenced by the results of such an assembly?
So the Supreme Court's belief that it is the uber legislator is a terrible problem in American democracy today. And we've got to get the court back to what was a traditionally conservative idea, which is the Supreme Court has a role where the laws clearly violate a constitutional right. That's its role. but it's not supposed to be a policymaker that's deciding which policies it likes and which it opposes and bending the law to fit to its judgments. But I actually think in the context of money in politics, the Supreme Court is not going to be a problem to the kind of reforms we need. So number one, in Maine, nobody believes this, but in Maine, we have an initiative that'll be on the November ballot that will tee up the question whether super PACs are in fact required by the Constitution. Supreme Court's never addressed that question. And I mean, it was decided by lower courts and everybody just basically followed the lower courts. Court's never been asked to address it. It's pretty obvious once you take the time necessary to study it that this court, this Supreme Court, will decide that super PACs are not constitutionally required. And when it decides that, a law which is now on the books regulating contributions to independent political action committees will come back to life. So that decision by the Supreme Court will be enormously valuable. And the other thing we need in American politics is public funding of public elections. Now, the Supreme Court has said again and again that that's constitutional. There's nothing unconstitutional about using public money to fund public elections. We just need to build the political will to do that. Right now, people don't do much about that because they think super PACs will just wash out any positive effect. But if we remove super PACs, we can revive the democratic movement, I think, for public funding of public elections.
Thank you. That's it. Thank you, first of all, for everything. This has been very fabulous. The question that I have in my mind when you were showing around approval of Trump and different things is where I've seen a shift, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, is that you noticed when Nixon was clearly, people accepting his support. What I hear now, and I think it's true, but could be AI generated, is that there are many Republican leaders who actually don't like Trump and don't agree with him, but the fear of retribution. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how we fight that, because if we lose leadership, we lose integrity. That's a very sad state.
Yeah, thank you. When I started teaching at the University of Chicago, I had Liz Cheney and John Eastman in my class. And John Eastman was the crazy guy who was trying to get Vice President Pett. But Liz Cheney was an extraordinary student. And obviously I'm enormously proud in what she's done, but she has made us aware of the fact that integrity has disappeared in this field. And part of that is just the consequence of the enormous political power that gets produced by persistently being able to poll people and ask what they think, right? So on January 6th, there are many Republicans who thought, thank God this is over. Because even, Lindsey Graham on the floor of the Senate said, I'm off the train now. Like, it's finished. Like, this is the end. And then they got the overnight polls, and it turned out their base was even more supportive of Donald Trump after that event than afterwards. And they felt like there's nothing they can do. Now, I think it's all on all of us to hold them to account. They're not, you don't have any representative you need to hold to account, obviously. But all of us as American citizens need to hold them to account and expect integrity. I think too many Americans have come to expect they won't have any integrity. They're just politicians, as if politicians is an excuse to lie or to dissemble in the way that Bill Clinton did or any number of other people do. And that is a really terrifying fact about politicians. It's another reason to try to think about the other structure of citizen assemblies, because the thing about citizen assemblies is the members are not politicians. They're picked, they make a decision, they go home. That's it. There's no running for re-election or making deals with corporations or anything like that.
So I think that's it.
There's one thing, thank you, I agree entirely, and yay town meeting where there's actual deliberation.
Yes.
We don't have secure elections. They are riggable. They have been rigged. When they are not tested or only tested by the loser, and the elections themselves are not set up such that cheating is not possible, and which they are not set up like that. Kerry won in 2004, and the outcome in Ohio was switched afterwards. Gore won in 2000, and he didn't have to give up. Hillary did not join Jill Stein's lawsuit in 2016. That would have discovered if, and I suspect the truth of, some real shenanigans in the vote counting in 2016. We need to have actually certifiable afterwards without saying we should all be as strong as Trump is in testing the results, and not say that he's a sore loser because of it. That's something we need to do too, because if we don't have, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And when people say, there's no evidence it was rigged, I think, well, actually, yes, there is. You just don't know about it, but you haven't read these articles.
Yeah, so I would say that what you said, when you said, and we need to deal with that problem, is exactly right. We very stupidly, in my view, hand over counting to machine companies that have proprietary software that run their machines. Now, I don't know enough to know whether those machines are manipulated or not, but I do know that there's no reason it has to be proprietary software that runs those machines.
But we don't need it. We can check anyway. There are good things we could do.
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm not disagreeing with you. There are lots of things we can do, and this is one of them, all that I'm saying. We could have a series of reforms that give all of us confidence in the results. And I absolutely think we need to do that. And that will require spending money to do that and giving money to the states to do that, because the United States federalist system disperses that responsibility among so many different jurisdictions. And that's what makes it particularly costly. What's interesting is other countries don't have this problem at all. When Bolsonaro when he moved to Florida, but in Brazil, was challenging the election results, they had a system that overnight could be 100% certain about what the results were, and nobody was saying with any credibility that it was the votes were stolen. It was, that something had happened that made it so he was not going to win. So other countries are able to do it. We should be able to do it. So I completely agree. Because it has a lot more of a central structure. Now, I don't think we have to give up decentralized, but we have to adopt standards that we have a reliable way to verify. And that, in my view, is open source projects that are enabled to provide that transparency.
Thank you so much. There's so many good questions coming around. We have a question online. With regard to cultivation of active participatory democracy, do you have anything to say about New England town meeting traditions and their effectiveness or anything?
Yeah, so I think it's inspirational, but the question is, what should it inspire? So it was an incredible innovation designed to make the system more democratic. And I think that for many years, it's done exactly that. And I think it could be complemented now with other ways of increasing the representative character of this democratic process. So, my wife is on Brookline Town Meeting. So twice a year, she spends endless hours away from the family. I assume she's at town meeting. And what the work they do is extraordinary to watch, because it is the very best of democracy. But it's not a representative body in the sense of it doesn't represent renters. Brookline doesn't have a lot of minority population. It actually has a proportion of minority that's equal to, but not the wealth difference that you might imagine. And so the point is, we could create a perfectly representative sample that stands next to it. And not for every issue, but the really fundamental issues Brookline needs to resolve, I think the town meeting would be advised to say, okay, let's run this through the citizen assembly, town meeting assembly, and see what that body thinks. And eventually, I think people will be, I want to do what that body says, as opposed to the town meeting. But not in the beginning. It's got to earn its way, and it does that by demonstrating that it has sensible answers to hard problems.
Thank you. You mentioned some people might think you're crazy. Don't you think that they often bring that when someone gives a different perspective as conspiracy theories, making the facts and all that? So in Harvard, they removed the lady president recently. From the time of James Madison, he had said, if all men were angels, no governments will be necessary. So on that premise, he concludes that governments are necessary. But we can take it the opposite way, because those that are angels never go in governments. So governments are totally, most of the time, against democracy and truth. And Plato was very concerned about democracy. So if the American people, and I've been in this country since just before Reagan was elected president, but I'm a peace activist, human rights activist, pilgrim, walk with groups and along all over the world. This is the most naive population in the world, trusting the government and media propaganda, and the least informed about the world population. And it's about 4.25 of the world's population. Still want to control more than 70% of the resources. What democracy are we talking about?
Yeah. Look, you're not going to get me to defend what we have, but I have been trying to defend what we could build. When the framers created our democracy, representative democracy, which they call a republic, the reigning theories on democracy, from Aristotle to Montesquieu, said that if you have elections, it will tend towards aristocracy. But if you have sortition, or rule by lot, or random selection of people to be in government, it will tend towards democracy. And what we don't remember, or never learned, is that there's been about 3,000 years of history with systems that are democratic in the sense of trying to serve the people as opposed to a king or an aristocracy. And only about 250 years of history of using elections to constitute the representatives in those democracies. Now, the framers did that because they made the second half of the mistake that you talked about. They thought not that they could support an aristocracy, but that there would be an aristocracy of leaders, because they looked around at the other framers and they thought, we're pretty good. We're pretty well read. We know a lot. We'll just set up a government and people like us will go to Washington. Now, of course, very quickly they realized, Madison in particular, just how terrible the actual representatives were. I mean, not through history, they're all terrible. There are a lot that I have enormous respect for even today, but it's not the very best. It's not the cream of the crop. And there are a lot of people who go there for the worst possible reasons. So that's why I think there's a real reason to be skeptical of trying to run democracies exclusively through elections. Now, we're not going to change that tomorrow. People need to be convinced, they need to be shown, not told. So that's why I'm talking about a process for building an alternative. But the process for building an alternative is happening especially around the world right now. And as that happens, and we empower random, representative, informed, deliberated publics, I absolutely have faith that the decisions of those bodies will be better than any other system anywhere in the world, because I think that that process avoids the natural tendency to concentrate power. And if that process were to consider the other really important point you said about the United States believing it needs to control all the resources in the world, it's our natural God-given right to do that. It would be harder to sustain those policies in the context of processes that were informed and deliberated. So it's not that anybody imagines we have a perfect alternative. But I do think, I'm not gonna do the Winston Churchill quote, but I do think there are ways to imagine moving this democracy in a way that makes it fundamentally better and avoids the really horrible things that our current system of government produces.
I've been given the word from President Hughes that we can only ask one more question. There are so many, I know, interesting questions about to be asked, but so we were actually one of the first.
Thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation, your discussion. It's fascinating. I just want to make sure that the takeaways that I have are correct. So I'm thinking of call to action, right? One call to action you have is to create citizen assemblies. So my question tied to that is, how do we scale that up? What can we do to scale up the citizen assembly idea first? And the second part that I heard was to practice understanding the other side. And the question tied to that is education. I mean, I'm an educator in schools. We try to have our students learn how to hear the other side in an open, honest kind of way to have a dialogue. But if you haven't said anything about our educational system as a whole in this need to bring democracy back to where it needs to be. And I'd like to hear your thoughts on that, because I have a bias that the public is becoming more and more ignorant of what it takes to run a democracy.
Yeah. So as to the first, I'm very eager to connect you to entities that are working on the scaling problem. There's actually a couple interesting experiments that are happening. One is the relatively expensive citizen assembly process, where you actually physically gather people together, and those tend to be quite difficult to run. There's these really interesting systems like Polis, which is used in Taiwan to radically change their democracy in Taiwan, and versions of Polis, which are good AI-driven systems that can engage with tens of thousands of people in a community to figure out where common ground is. And they do it in a very intuitive way. Like, they'll send you a question, you answer it, and then you ask you to rank answers, like, do you put this one above that one? And through a series of iterations, they can develop an understanding of what the common view is within a community. And then you can decide where there's a real need to deliberate, because you can see there's no common view about this issue, but there is about that issue. These are much less expensive to run, and we're going to try to experiment with these in Brookline too. So I think right now we're in a mode of experimenting, and I'm happy to help enable that. With respect to education, so in the theoretical sense, you and I are both educators. I have more freedom as an educator, I believe, than you probably do if you're in the K through 12 system. And the reason for that is education itself has become deeply political, right? So we ran a project to run virtual deliberations about the Electoral College and how the Electoral College works and what changes you could make to make it work better. We took this idea to Texas, and Texas school boards rejected the ability to talk about the Electoral College because it was too political. It was like, that's the point. It's about the politics of our country. Like, we need to be able to talk about the Electoral College. No, we're not going to talk about the Electoral College. It's too divisive. And I was like, so the point is, like, these institutions, as I'm sure you experience day to day, are incredibly oppressive to the opportunity to have the kind of education that's necessary. But I absolutely agree with you. We need this education. I don't think we're going to get it in 140 days between now and the election. What we need to find in those times, and again, people here, how are you going to do it? I mean, it's not like there's a lot of division around Concord. But in the nation as a whole, learning to listen, to hear the truth in the other side, not the crazy, because it's easy to hear the crazy. And as you watch what your social media feeds you, it feeds you the crazy, because it knows you want to hear the crazy. You want to be convinced that you're wise and they're crazy. You got to resist it, and you got to look for it. And that's really hard, especially when it's so terrifying what the alternatives here could be.
I think you picked Texas. I mean, they're like the extreme cases of like.
When they hold control of the texts.
It's only because we had a person in Texas who wanted to do it. So she took it to the school boards in Texas. It wouldn't have been like the first on my list, but that's.
Anywhere
You're
in
phenomenal, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
We are
Thank you so much.
grateful to have
Well, thank you all for coming. I apologize for the various
Vanessa,
technical
If
difficulties.
you listened to her talk at the graduation in Harvard just recently, or if you read her book, she also has struggled with Facebook and all the controls and what it did. And
Yes.
she won the Nobel Prize for taking that on. I don't know if Concord will win the Nobel Prize for taking on issues, but let us try. Let's make good trouble, as John Lewis says, and let's keep at it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
And I hope you can focus on the interesting things that he had to say and kind of try and forget the technical stuff. I apologize for that, but thank you all for coming. And this ends our meeting. Appreciate it. Good luck to everybody. Have a good rest of the week.